Hello, this is Chanda Smith-Baker from the Minneapolis Foundation, where I am the Senior Vice President of Impact and the host of Conversations with Chanda. For Valerie to take the time was such modeling of how even in your busiest moments, you make time to support others. The event at Motherwell was an event by women for women. And then in the midst of it, she found time to be part of this conversation. Her comments were great. And I felt warm and quite respected and affirmed, or, all of those great things. But I think more importantly is that I'm picking up with how I want to continue to be in my work, and that the importance of the little things matter, that you can't just pay attention to what's on your calendar, but sometimes it's what's in between it that ends up being the most impactful. So I just wanted to share with you. So number one, I just launched this podcast.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm at the Minneapolis Foundation, and I'm the Senior VP of Impact. I've been in philanthropy about 1.5 years. And so I'm discovering my voice in this role. And I'm just really excited to talk with you. I've seen you talk several times. There's so much I appreciate about your leadership, and what I sense is humility and your ability to relate that I hope that I can demonstrate in my own leadership. So it's quite an honor.
What a nice thing to say. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
And for the audience, would you mind just introducing yourself?
My name is Valerie Jarrett. I'm from Chicago, although I still kind of live in Washington. And I'm in the process of figuring out what to do with my voice now.
Really interesting. So you have a new book out.
I do.
Finding My Voice. How did you come up with that title?
Well, the book is about my story, my journey, how I went from a painfully shy youngster to a woman who became an advocate for others and for myself, particularly for those who didn't have the power to advocate for themselves, and and the obstacles that I encountered along the way, and the barriers that I had to break through, and the highs and the lows of both my professional and my personal life. And over the course of that time, I discovered to trust the most important voice, and that's the one inside of each of us, and to try to use it to be a force for good. And so finding that voice is what my life's journey has really been all about.
In your book, you talk about your dad's story too, which is obviously completely connected to yours. And the title, I believe, of chapter 1 is The Gift of Freedom.
Yes.
And there's something just about like that title that is so significant, and really sharing a bit about his challenges perhaps that he faced as an African-American physician, and then going international and not facing some of the same assumptions, not having to deal with the Jim Crow laws and the inability to kind of break into the medical field. How do you think that experience has informed your work?
Well, I think the experience was my early years were very valuable in that my dad did leave the United States because he couldn't find a job equivalent to his white counterparts. And he and my mom were adventuresome spirits. And so they thought, well, if there's not an opportunity for us here, let us go somewhere else. And by going halfway across the world to Iran, where he was offered the opportunity to start a new hospital and chair the Department of Pathology there, in a sense, I was born over that color barrier that had been so oppressive for both of my parents growing up under Jim Crow. And so at the time when I was going to an international school with kids from all over the world, Ruby Bridges was integrating her school in New Orleans. And so because those first 5 years of my life, I didn't feel the enormous burdens of discrimination and racism that my parents had felt. They kind of brought me over the color barrier. And so it was a culture shock when I returned to the United States and discovered, that racism and discrimination was still alive and well, and that as a light-skinned African-American, I was experiencing that from my own community. And my mom had said, I want you to go to the United States because I want you to know what it's like to be an African-American. And at that point, we probably said Negro. And then I was like, wait a minute, I'm getting beat up by those kids. And so it was really kind of me trying to figure out, well, how do I fit in this new world when race had never been an issue for the beginning of my life. And so it took a minute for me to kind of figure it out and find my place and become a part of a community that began with my family, an African-American family that had been very successful in Chicago and had always worked hard and had broken all kinds of color barriers. And that became kind of my true north, but also became like, well, how am I ever going to live up to those enormous expectations that were set by people who came before me because of their accomplishments?
Yeah. You say, you talk about feeling like you can't live up to those expectations and then feeling like you can do everything.
Yes.
Like that's
schizophrenic.
That's a quite of a tension.
Depending on the day. Yeah. And sometimes in the same day, it's like, oh, I can do anything. I was like, oh, how can I do anything?
Mm-hmm. And how has that impacted, because it made me think of Lean In, the imposter syndrome, like all of those things that exist for us as women and for African-American women. And
they're all very real. And I think part of what I try to do is just talk about them through my story, as opposed to labeling them necessarily. Just say, like, this is what I experienced, and I had to overcome the shyness, and I had to figure out how to fit in, and some of it I did in ways that I wouldn't do today. So, for example, I never talked about being born in Iran, and I had a British accent, which I lost the first time I got teased, and I didn't share my story. As a youngster, I was kind of ashamed of being different. And now I realize that part of who I am is because of that early part of my story. And so I try to encourage other people to be open about their stories. And I thought if I wrote a book that was really candid about both my professional and personal life, and just put it all out there, that it would humanize me in a way that people would be more inclined to see their story in my story. Mm-hmm. I don't want people to just see not the finished project because I'm still a work in progress, but I don't want them to see me today and assume I was always this person. We all evolve.
And is it something that you still struggle with, but you just have better tools to overcome it?
No, I'm not shy at all anymore.
No?
I'm over it. But it took decades. It was not easy. No, I'm just not shy.
Was it just jumping in and doing it and just
over and over and over again?
And affirmation and
yes, you get positive reinforcement and I didn't used to be funny. I'm pretty funny now. And I think it's practice. And I can't even tell you when it became fun. But I know I went from this, knot in my stomach and painful feeling anytime I had to speak in front of more than 5 people to, I can't wait to go back and talk to this audience again. And I think some of it it's easier now because there are no political stakes. I can say whatever I want to say. I'm not having to be as measured and as careful as when I was in the White House, and it would reflect not just on me but the President of the United States. So I'm free. I'm kind of totally unshackled right now.
Yeah.
And it's great. I'm enjoying it.
Well, we have a similar story. I often tell a story about me failing a speech class because my anxiety was so much. And now I'm just amazed at myself when I can get up in front of people and have conversations.
But see, now you tell me that and I feel this affinity to you because I couldn't have even taken a speech class. I would have been too shy to do that. And I was at an event a few weeks ago and a guy who I've known forever and I know his kids, he came up to me. I haven't seen one of his son in a while, and he said, my son is painfully shy. Would you write a note in the book that will help him realize that you were shy too? And you realize everybody's dealing with these normal anxieties, and I thought I was superhuman in those early years, and I could handle everything myself. And no, we all need help. We're all vulnerable. We all, fall and stumble, and that failure can't define you. It should strengthen you and you learn from it and you get back up. And I think the resilience is one thing I'm actually a little worried about with this younger generation because
I was going to ask that.
What they call them, the snowplow parents that are paving the way for them, and the
helicopter,
and the programming them to death so that they don't have a free moment to just play and pretend and experiment and see that they can actually work things out on their own. We don't have to intervene on everything. And get them off social media so that they can actually experience each other and not talk at each other behind the veil of anonymity, but actually look into somebody's eyes and sense them as a human being. So I'm a little worried, and you're hearing that depression is up among high school and college age kids.
Suicides are up.
I think all of this is contributory, and so figuring out a way to write a book that would be human and honest was like my contribution.
Do you think that the way that young people are experiencing leadership is different than how they experienced it when you were growing up? Like, do you think that there's more acceptance or understanding that it's imperfect, like you can be imperfect and still be a leader? Or do you think that there's a different level of demand around leadership that didn't exist?
That's an interesting question. I guess it's a mixed bag. So, like, I do think we tend to put leaders on pedestals, but it's easier to command an audience today because everybody has a phone, right? And you know, these kids who are influencers, well, they haven't actually done anything, but they've turned themselves into influencers.
LeBron James' 13-year-old son got 1 million followers in 24 hours. He's 13 years old. I mean, amazing influencer at 13. But and you wonder
should we be influenced by 13-year-olds?
I don't know, but he's an influencer. I know that's dangerous in some ways.
I think it's a lot of power in the hands of young people.
And pressure, perhaps.
And enormous pressure to continue. Well, if you got 1 million in the first day, what are you going to do the next day? And what are you going to do the next day? And they're checking and they're comparing themselves. I'm not talking about his son, but I'm saying more generally, to people's projections of their best self that they put out there. Nobody puts their bad stuff up on social media. You pretend you're perfect, and then people go, well, why can't I have that, and why I don't measure up? And then it feeds these kind of deep-seated insecurities that I worry about. So to me, mental health is tied with being honest in relationships and having people around you who are supportive of you and nurturing of you. And I don't get that from my device, quite frankly.
Gotcha. When, I just lost my question.
Don't you hate that? Don't you hate that when that happens?
I do, and it was really good. It was super good. Identifying talent is where it was going to go. So, I've heard you speak before, and I know kind of the story of you and Michelle Obama. But I think beyond that, I think because of that story, for me, I've made some assumptions, and I think it illustrates perhaps your ability to identify and nurture and support people in leadership. Can you talk about kind of managing teams? Some of the audience are maybe new to identifying talent, or maybe they see talent one particular way, and perhaps they're not always open to someone just walking in your office.
Well, so I think I have a pretty good eye for talent. And part of it is I listen, and I try to see whether what motivates people. And I listen to their stories, and I think you can tell a lot about a person by their story. And Michelle Robinson told me her story, and it was a very compelling story of why she was interested in public service. And it had nothing to do with Princeton undergrad and Harvard Law School, and everything to do with growing up from a working class family on the south side of Chicago. And a father who, with a disability, had committed himself to service, and she loved Chicago and wanted to give back. I found that a compelling story. And I think part of what we have to do is to figure out how we help support people to take it to the next phase. Not to say, okay, you're a young person, I think you should be president one day. Just like, okay, well, what can you do? Well, incrementally, how can we help one another progress throughout life's path, in whatever direction it takes you? And I'm not big any longer on like a 10-year plan. I had a stupid 10-year plan in my life. But I am about increasing the aperture of opportunity for myself and for those people who I care a lot about. And so identifying talent, I think, and nurturing it are kind of related, which is building relationships with one another and investing and caring about the other person and being an honest sounding board, so they can come to you and say, well, I'm thinking about this or I'm thinking about that. What do you think? And when you share the same values and your same commitment to service, for example, it's easier to do that.
Yeah. We're seeing lots of signs of people that are struggling with telling truth to power. And it's happening at the most visible levels, but it's happening in our workplaces where people get enamored, or there's not the trust that's built, or a number of barriers perhaps. I mean, do you think it's eroding our institutions and our
I think I'm worried about our institutions, and again, it's back to young people. They're not affiliating in the way that my generation did. Some of my affiliation was geographic, the community I grew up in. I knew the people that owned the local grocery store and the dry cleaner, and the teachers in our schools lived in the community. I had a big family, extended family, they all lived in the area. Now our community is self-defined in this device again. And I worry that we are living in echo chambers, safe, comfortable, and that the adventure of life and the enrichment of decisions, back to your earlier question about building a team, a healthy team, is appreciating diversity as a strength. And that's not just diversity of race and religion and gender, but it's a diversity of perspectives. And we shouldn't be scared about that. We should embrace it. I want somebody who disagrees with me to come and let's go at it and disagree without being disagreeable. And I am worried that we're losing that fabric and that people are not defining themselves in terms of the institutions to which they're affiliated. In fact, to some degree, they're shunning institutions completely, whether it's government or business or religion, and they're just like going it alone. And they're going to build their own institution, which is really not an institution. But our democracy relies on institutions, government being the principal one, but it's not government in isolation, it's government interacting with we the people. And if we don't feel that affiliation, then we don't vote, which is why 43% of the country didn't vote in the last election, or last presidential election.
So last
That's
question.
troubling.
Yeah, it is very troubling. Since I'm in philanthropy now, I'm wondering if you see a role for philanthropy in this, either
Absolutely.
creating space for people to come together or addressing issues?
Absolutely. You will have the purse strings. And when you invite people to come to the table, they show up. And I think inviting people to the table who have different opinions and using your good offices to say, yes, we're going to have a conversation, let's say, around gun violence. And we're going to invite people who feel that, you know, taking a gun away from them is like a fate worse than death. And we're going to invite people who lost their children to gun violence. And we're going to, let's have a conversation and let's see if we can find some common ground. I don't think there's enough effort today to find common ground or even to compromise and to recognize that in a big, complicated country such as ours, it's not my way or the highway. It's better understanding of the truth. It's better appreciation for how we should feel invested in one another and not just in ourselves. And I'm worried that because of technology and because of this frustration with government and with business, people are not as loyal to their employers, and the employers aren't as loyal to their workers. And all of that can fester, I think, in a really unhealthy way. And so the question is, what do we all do to bring ourselves together and feel this kinship even when we're different?
Yeah. It's very interesting that people see philanthropy as money, and what you're saying is basically use our power, influence, our cachet to basically bring people together, to expand the way of thinking and their connections to each other.
If you invite people, they'll show up. And once you get them at the table, then I think their nature will be to be curious. It's just getting them to the table. And so you can be conveners, and you can do it around any substantive area you want, or you could just convene people and say, look, we're going to have an interesting conversation, and get people to use that muscle of listening to one another and actually hearing one another. And so I think philanthropy is an institution that is still well respected by many and that can influence way beyond just the purse strings.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
I hope you're enjoying our city.
I love your city. It's good down.
And I'm loving your book.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm so glad you enjoy it.
Yes.
It's good to meet you
Very
all.
nice to meet you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Please check out the Minneapolis Foundation website to find more episodes of this podcast, information on upcoming events, and for my book recommendations. Thank you to Weber Shandwick for their partnership and support in making this podcast come alive.